Most builders don't talk about this publicly because it feels really uncomfortable to be selective when it comes to your clients. But if you've been in custom home building for any amount of time, you know the client relationship is one of the most consequential things you'll manage on any project. Sometimes it's more consequential than the build itself. A difficult client doesn't just create friction, they drain your team's time and focus, they create legal exposure, they delay decisions, and they can turn a project that you should be a win into something you dread showing up to. So I want to talk honestly about what that actually looks like, how to try to recognize it before it starts, and then how to handle it when you're already in it. So here's what I'm going to cover. First, I want to explain why custom home clients are uniquely challenging compared to almost any other client relationship in construction, because the dynamics here are different from what most people expect going in. Then I'll walk through the patterns I've seen that signal a difficult client early, before you've signed anything. After that, I'll talk through how to manage the relationship once a project is underway and things start to go sideways. And I'll close with what I've come to believe about the decision to turn down work, because that's a much harder call than it sounds, and most builders and owners don't make it confidently until they've been burned a few times. Let me start by explaining this is harder in custom and luxury construction than in almost any other context. When someone buys a production home, there are defined choices, defined timelines, and defined expectations. The buyer selects from a menu and the builder executes. In a custom home, especially at a high price point, the client is often involved in hundreds of decisions over the course of a year or more. They have opinions about everything, and they should. It's their forever home. But that involvement creates a relationship that is long, emotionally loaded, and genuinely personal in a way that most business relationships just aren't. This is not simply a transaction. It's a process, and the client's personality and behavior have a direct effect on how that process goes. A client who's anxious will create delays. A client who's indecisive will create scope creep. A client who doesn't trust you will micromanage everything. And a client who has unrealistic expectations will be disappointed no matter the outcome. And none of that has anything to do with your work quality. It has everything to do with who you decided to work with. And that's the piece most builders underestimate going in. They evaluate the project, the size, the lot, the budget, and the design, and they don't spend nearly enough time evaluating the person. Look, I get it, because the project is what you're selling and the client is who's paying. You want to win jobs, but in this business, you cannot separate them. The client is part of the project. So what does a difficult client actually look like before you sign? There are patterns, and once you've seen them a few times, you're gonna start to recognize them earlier. One of the most consistent ones is chronic indecision paired with urgency. This is a client who cannot make a decision on anything during the design and the selection process, but constantly remind you of the schedule and act though the delays are coming only from your side. This indecision is a tell. In a custom home, someone who struggles to commit to tile or hardware or paint colors is gonna struggle at every stage of the project. And that struggle compounds over time into real schedule and budget consequences, not just for your client, which can add frustration, but also for you and your team in planning purposes, because they're taking up a person and a resource the longer their project goes. Another one is scope creep as a default. Some clients approach a custom home with a fixed vision and they stick to it. Others treat the project as a living document, continuously adding and revising and changing their minds about things that have already been decided and paid for. There's a version of that is completely manageable because changes happen on a custom project. We expect it. We want them to happen. But when it becomes a pattern where the client seems genuinely incapable of making a final decision or reversing a decision, that's a structural problem. And it just doesn't get better as the project progresses. It actually gets worse because the stakes feel higher the further along you are. A third pattern is what I call authority without accountability. This is the client, or more often the couple, where one person is a decision maker and the other one isn't. But you really don't find that out until you're mid-project and decisions start getting reversed. You often see this when one's coming to the showroom meetings and one's writing the checks, and they're just not aligned. And unfortunately, that frustration, it pours over into you as the builder. So that client who defers everything to a spouse or a parent, and then they come back saying that's not what we wanted ultimately. When you don't have a clear single point of contact with actual decision-making authority, you're managing multiple relationships and multiple standards simultaneously. And that is a setup for conflict. And then there's the client who negotiates everything. I don't mean the client who pushes back or asks fair questions. We want those when we expect those. I mean the client who treats every single invoice, change order, conversation about money as an adversarial negotiation they have to feel like they have to win. You'll spend more time defending than you will building that house. And the relationship will ultimately become transactional in a way that makes it very difficult to solve problems together when something unexpected happens. You go from working together to working against one another, and that's just not good. There's a new version of client that's become more common recently, and I want to spend a little bit of time on it because I think that a lot of builders are starting to run into this. We had a client who not long ago would come to every meeting having clearly run our language, our trade recommendations, and our pricing through ChatGPT before they sat down with us. And look, I have nothing against someone doing their research. That wasn't the issue. The issue was how it showed up in the room. They'd pull out their phone and read a a summary of what AI told them about a particular clause in our contract or what a fair price should be with no market context. They'd have questions about specific subs or specific market conditions. They would use AI as a citation that they fundamentally believed over everything else. It was as though whatever the model generated carried the same weight as 15 years of doing this work with contractors. At one point, they started questioning a trade recommendation, someone we'd worked with for years, someone whose work we stood behind without any hesitation, and they did a great job, which is why we used them, simply because they had searched that trade online and ChatGPT had surfaced a concern about a similar company that had a similar name but was in a different state. And that was actually the basis of pushback. Then they couldn't be wrong. What made it difficult wasn't that they were using AI, it's that they were using it as a substitute for trust rather than a tool for understanding. Now look, you have to earn trust. I understand that. This was a situation that started from the very beginning simply because we didn't read the warning signs of the contract getting run through the language. So there's a difference between a client who asks smart questions because they want to understand your reasoning and a client who arrives with generated counter arguments because they fundamentally don't trust anyone else and they're simply looking for leverage to feel like they win. The first kind of client makes you sharper. The second kind exhausts you. And the tell in both cases is whether the conversation is actually going anywhere. With the first client, you explain your reasoning and they engage with it. They ask good follow-up questions and you continue to progress forward. With the second, no explanation is ever quite enough because the goal isn't understanding, it's simply to feel like they won. I'm not gonna tell you that AI is the problem here, it really isn't. The problem is the underlying dynamic, and that dynamic existed long before anyone had a chatbot to cite. Technology's just made it a little bit easier for a certain kind of client to feel armed without being informed, and that's a pattern worth recognizing very early. If someone arrives at your first few conversations referencing AI-generated contract red lines or printed cost comparisons from a general search with no local context, pay attention to what that's telling you about how they view this relationship. It usually means they came in skeptical and they're looking for reasons to stay that way. So what do you do when you see these signals? The cleanest answer, just decline the project. I know that that's not easy, especially early in the business or in a market where new projects are hard to come by, but I can tell you from experience that bad projects stay bad projects. They cost you in ways that do not show up in your margin calculation. It's in the morale, opportunity cost, and the relationships with your team and your trades that get strained when a project's constantly in conflict mode. Turning down work is a skill, and it gets a lot easier the more that you practice it. You don't owe anyone a lengthy explanation. You can simply say that after reviewing everything, you just don't think you're the right fit. That's a professional response, and it closes the conversation cleanly. So what if you signed a contract with someone who's a couple months into the build and now they're starting to exhibit these patterns? The first thing I'd say is you have to get clear on your documentation immediately. And you also have to get clear on your expectations with that client because every decision, change order, and conversation affects the scope or budget or timeline needs to be in writing. Not because you're preparing for a dispute, while that is a possibility, you just have to be clear with your documentation that can create accountability in a way that the verbal conversations, they just don't. So always make sure that you are documenting everything with this client. And when a client says they never agreed to something, you can simply show them the email or the communication. When they say the timeline is misrepresented, you can show them the schedule they signed off on. Documentation is not meant to be adversarial. It's how to protect both parties and set and keep proper expectations so that the project is grounded in facts instead of feelings. Feelings are where you can get into trouble. The second thing is to get ahead of problems instead of reacting to them. Difficult clients are almost always more anxious than they are unreasonable. That anxiety is what turns into conflict. It's when they don't feel like they know what's going on or they don't feel like they know what's happening. So the more proactive you get with your communication with regular updates and clear explanations of what's coming next, honest conversations about delays will help the clients on their own feel a little bit better. Gives them a little bit less ammunition to escalate. It also creates a better working relationship. And you have to know your client going in and understand how do they need to be communicated with. And you can take care of all of this early. You can't eliminate their anxiety. That's normal in a build, but you can give it fewer things to attach to that can lead to further escalation and further problems. The third thing is to hold your scope documents and your change order process firmly. There's a reason that you have it. When a client wants to make a change, the change order is not optional. It's not bureaucratic paperwork. It is a mechanism that keeps the project honest and it protects both of you. The builder who lets changes happen informally is a builder who ends up absorbing costs that were never in the original agreement. Once you've done that, the client will expect it every single time. Trust me, no good deed goes unpunished here. None of this is a guarantees of smooth outcome. Some clients are just genuinely hard to manage. And the honest answer is in those situations, you'd have a conversation about how best to continue your relationship. Because You can manage everyone. You just have to understand that person better. That is a very hard conversation. But that conversation is way better than grinding through 12 months of a project that is completely broken down all aspects of trust. So if your contract allows for termination, you need to understand those conditions, understand when you want to get to that point, and understand how to salvage it with people. If you're in a situation where the relationship has deteriorated to where it's affecting your team and your other client, you have a responsibility to address it. Not just protect yourself, but to protect the quality of the work and the integrity of this business you spent so much time building. So the broader principle here is that in custom home building, client selection is a core business function. It's not a soft skill or a secondary consideration. It determines your project quality, your team culture, your reputation, and your margin at least as much as your construction practices do. The builder who consistently has good clients did not get lucky. They built a process for evaluating clients and bringing the right ones on. They got comfortable saying no, and they invested in communication and documentation that kept relationships grounded. Those things compound over time into a business that is genuinely easier to run because the work itself is hard enough without adding the weight of a broken relationship on top of it. So if this landed for you, a like and a subscribe helps this content reach more builders. And if you've got a situation you're working through or you have a question about a specific client dynamic, drop it in the comments. I'd be happy to dig into it with you.